On February 24th, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Ziegler here in Chicago. Ziegler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Previously, on Call Edna, Bruce said, quoting, "If my life is taken, the responsible ones will be William E. Maloney, John Lynch, Lloyd Little, and William Green." We need to talk about two of the men from the list who made threats against Bruce's life almost a year and a day prior to his murder. And those men are William Maloney and John Lynch. On February 23rd, 1932, Maloney and Lynch chased Ziegler through the street in the area of the Board of Trade building in downtown Chicago, and Ziegler escapes by running towards Jackson Boulevard and getting in a taxi. And he went on to tell us that he was alone in the office that day when Maloney came to visit him. He said, "Bruce, we want you to step down." "What do you mean?" said Pop. "We want you to give up the fight and go along with us," said Maloney, and he put a huge roll of bills on the desk. "Here's 50 grand, and that's only a start." "You know I'd never go along," said Pop. Pulling out a revolver, Maloney put it to Pop's head and said, "It's either that or this." Indicating the money, Pop said, "Well, it will never be that." This is more than Bruce was just trying to fight the amalgamation process for Local 569. Bruce potentially had tipped off federal investigators of tax fraud for William Maloney. And to me, that's his biggest motive for murder. So Huddle's not someone who would have been responsible for Bruce's murder, but he sets up someone who really could be. And that's William Maloney, who's only growing more and more suspicious as time passes. Episode 7, The Snake. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna, where we're solving a Prohibition-era cold case. In a brief content warning before we start today's episode, there will be a brief discussion of suicide, so I wanted to let you know in the beginning of the episode if you want to skip this one, and any discussion will not be included in the next episode's recap. Today, we are discussing none other than William Maloney. This name has come up so many times throughout our investigation, and it's finally time to look at him as an individual, looking into his personal background, his professional background, and if he has any motive or facts tying him to Bruce's murder. So let's get into it. I have to say up front, there's not a lot of information I was able to find about this man's personal life. He was born in Michigan in 1880 and doesn't appear to be born to means at all, and he dies in 1964. It's reported that he moves to Chicago around 1918, and I'm not exactly sure when he marries, but he marries late in life. And I also don't think he has any kids. His widow is mentioned in his obituary, but the obituary itself is a little sparse on personal information. In terms of when he got married, he was still listed as single in the 1940 census when he was about 60 years old. And then in the 1950 census, he's finally listed as married. So I'm thinking he gets married for the first time around 60 to 70 years old. As we know, when he moves to Chicago, he joins the operating engineers, eventually becoming a business agent and serving in that role for 5 years in the 1920s before the nonsense goes on with Local 150. And I wanted to say there's really two pivotal points in Maloney's career. First, you have the creation of Local 150 with him at the head. And this is a big deal because he goes from being a business agent with Local 569 to the head of an organization that is going to catapult him in terms of wealth, status, and power. And he accomplishes all of this, I'm sure, through some legitimate means, but also through a lot of racketeering and establishing firm control over a lot of the unions that Local 150 takes over. Because it's not just Bruce's union that he's interested in. He starts establishing trustee relationships with about 12 local unions. Maloney appoints himself as the trustee of each of them and then controls their affairs completely. And as a reminder for how he gets into Local 150, that can be accredited to Arthur Huddle, who was the president of the International in the late 20s and early 1930s. And he's appointed by Huddle into this role. He's not elected by the union members. And second is when he becomes the International's president in 1940. And this is why I mentioned that he didn't come from money, because he amasses a lot of wealth during his career. It's reported in the 1950s that he has at least 3 Cadillacs, 1 Chrysler Imperial, 12 safe deposit boxes full of who knows what. He's purchased a large estate in Arlington Heights in Illinois, a home in Miami Beach. At one point, he has a stable of racehorses, and he purchases a yacht. And if those purchases do not scream, I have made a lot of money, I don't know what else does, besides I've bought a stable of racehorses and a yacht. And it's really important in thinking about these 2 pivotal points of his career, the person who's sort of responsible for both of them. And I think that's Arthur Huddle. He's directly responsible for the first one in helping create Local 150. But because he's murdered in 1931, he really paves the way for Maloney to gain a lot of power and status during the 1930s so that he can become the International's president. And Huddle's murder also brings up some very important questions about Maloney and his proximity to violent acts. According to the Washington Herald from July 30th, 1932, quoting, "It was reported that a Chicago gunman, George McSellen, said he had been hired by William E. Maloney and John Posel to shoot Huddle and Langdon," end quote. So in the year after Huddle's death, Maloney is implicated in the murder of Arthur Huddle, but nothing really serious in the judiciary or otherwise happens as a result. It's just a rumor, but a pretty important one when we're thinking about whether he's responsible for Bruce's as well. And there are other instances of Maloney organizing violence against others in the 1940s and 50s. So Arthur Huddle and Bruce are not the only ones on Maloney's radar. According to the Chicago Tribune from January 28, 1958, from an article entitled "Union Robbed of Millions," Senate told, quoting, "Maloney was the central figure in an amazing story of goon squad beatings, kickbacks exacted of union members, sweetheart or substandard working contracts with favored employers, and protection of a convicted union boss." One of the goon squad victims, Theodore McCarty, appeared before the committee with both jaws wired together and toothless as a result of a beating. As Frank Lentino sat in the witness chair, McCarty pointed him out as one of the men who knocked out all his teeth and shattered his jaws, end quote. And there are other examples of operating engineers who fight against Maloney and meet similar violent fates, whether they're through Maloney or through their own means. One of those individuals, Roy Underwood, was fighting against Maloney in both Philadelphia and Chicago, and unfortunately, it didn't go well for him. He was penniless, lost his job, and not able to get another job. Feeling like he was out of options, he shot himself on April 3rd, 1959, in his garage. And this is the organization that Maloney is touting as one of the best-run unions. And although that may be true of the coffers of the union itself, it's very clear there were many members affected by Maloney. And as it relates to Bruce, since we're talking about Maloney's proximity to violent acts, we do have those 2 incidents. The one in Bruce's office where Maloney puts a gun to his temple and threatens him, and the one on the street where Maloney and Lynch chase Bruce, as 2 examples of direct violent threats against Bruce. So in thinking about Maloney and his culpability, there are multiple examples of his proximity to violence. However, there's not an example that I found where he was the perpetrator of that violence, and that's what I'm really curious about. Would he have been there on the day or pulling the trigger against Bruce? If you go by Huddle's account, he probably wouldn't have been. He would have hired someone, but it's something to think about as we continue to assess Maloney and his motive going forward. And speaking about Bruce and Maloney brings us to an incredible find that we found in our family papers. In going through a box of family papers, we found a copy of a newspaper called The Searchlight, devoted to the advancement of the interests of operating engineers. It's the second volume from September 1930, and on the front is a political cartoon making fun of Arthur Huddle. Then, when you turn the page and open up to page 3, someone's placed a check mark next to an article called Glorious Supervision. And that article is written by none other than Dennis Bruce Ziegler. And when we found this article, I shared it with my dad. We found something awesome. Look at this. The beginning of the Union fight was in 1929, 1930-ish.
Okay.
That's when Maloney started trying to take over Dennis's union.
Was it Malone or Maloney?
Maloney.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, I thought it was Malone. Okay.
Who did you think it was?
Actually, Malone was, that's where he worked for El Paso Electric Company, different guy.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sylvester Stallone, Malone, they're all the same people. But look, okay, so this is a publication from September 1930, The Searchlight, devoted to the advancement of the interests of operating engineers. And look who wrote this column called Glorious Supervision.
Wow.
Isn't that awesome?
It is neat. Let me see this.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
You can look at some of that rhetoric.
Oh my gosh. He had some thoughts for Mr. Maloney, I see here.
We said no wonder he made it on the hit list.
Wow. Wow. Oh, you took him to task publicly. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Wow. The big king snake.
Yeah.
And that's the big king snake who had him murdered 3 years later. My
Yeah.
gosh. Wow.
Probably. Do you know what I hadn't thought about much before a couple months ago? Hoisting and operating engineers. I had not thought once about them in my life. Mm-hmm. Now I think about them all the time.
But that's who these guys are, right?
Yeah, the whole group of them. Produced by, someone in Brooklyn.
Mm.
Are there any passages you like particularly? I like the name calling.
But is this where the article starts? It's kind of hard
It's a
to read.
collection of articles. So his starts here.
Okay.
With the Lord High Supervisor of Illegal Local 150. I think I read an article at one point that said Local 150 at one point had one member, and it was Maloney. What do you think?
That's amazing. So there was a real fight going on.
I was reading about the injunction that he referenced.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple different accounts of it. I know it happened. I'm not sure if it's started in 1929 or 1930.
It's amazing. So there was a real fight going on between the union and its members.
Yeah. And I have to read the Searchlight article to you because not only does it clear up some of the factual questions we had about things like the injunction, it's an unbelievable and honest account of what Bruce was feeling about Arthur Huddle and William Maloney in September of 1930, and potentially more motive as to why Maloney wanted to harm him. Before we read Glorious Supervision, I wanted to describe the front of the Searchlight for you, because it's an incredible political cartoon depicting Arthur Huddle. You have him as a mad boss sitting at a desk, slamming his fist and knocking over a telephone. He has a sign underneath him that says, "All rule or all ruin unionism." He has a thought bubble above him where he's talking and telling others, "Tell him to go to hell." And in the corner of the office, there are 3 large men pushing out union workers from the door. The large men have writing on their backs. One's listed as supervisor, contractor, politician, yes man. The union workers who are being pushed out the door have signs that say, union principles, we want representation, and we demand a fair trial before suspension. There's also some pictures on the wall behind Boss Huddle. Above them it says, the Tsar can do no wrong, and it has a picture of Napoleon, Mussolini, and the Kaiser. Again, it's September 1930. And there's also good Union men's cards being thrown in the trash. Above the cartoon, it says, the Kaiser forgot there was a day of retribution. And underneath the cartoon, it says, Kaiserism will ruin unionism. Representation of the rank and file should go with true unionism. And now for Bruce's article. Quoting, as exemplified by the very Honorable, Big Mogul William Maloney, Lord High Supervisor of Illegal Local Number 150, aided and abetted in his dirty, contemptible work of breaking up and completely destroying the Hoisting Engineers Union of Chicago, by such shining lights as John Tracy, who has had the distinction of sending shovel engineers into Herron, Illinois, a few years back to scab on the miners who were out on strike. Another shining light is John Lynch, a double-crosser to anybody that has had dealings with him, who sold his manhood and honor, what little he did possess, for a job licking the boots of his lord and master, Maloney. There are a few lesser lights who are also on their knees doing the bidding of this slimy creature called supervisor. Well, I imagine that the hoisting engineers, if there are any left who have had the extreme pleasure of working or living under a superior, ask what this is all about. To be brief, a little over a year ago, the grand and glorious King Snake supervisor over all he surveys, Little Artie Huddle, issued one of his famous proclamations, ordering Local Number 569 of Chicago to take into membership in their union what was known as Local Number 42. Steam shovel men whose jurisdiction covered about 1/5 of the United States. We were also ordered and directed by His Royal Highness to move our office in with Local Number 42. We were also told we could only have meetings once a month. Also that Punk Maloney, who was then business agent for Local 569, would have to be kept in office for 3 years. After all of this, we politely told King Artie to go to hell. And then we fired Maloney by unanimous vote. Space does not permit detailed report on what has happened in and out of courts in this case. End quote. When I read the opening of Bruce's article, I was astonished by the name-calling, and you really get an idea of how deeply these union workers like Bruce felt this issue. I mean, not only did I mention the date for the reference to the Kaiser, we're in the Great Depression. Work is becoming sparse. And so it's a big deal what Maloney and Huddle are up to. Continuing on, quoting, I will, however, relate to you how Local 569 applied for and was granted an injunction by the Circuit Court of Cook County, later having it made permanent, thus completely tying the hands of these conspirators from interfering with our organizations or our members, and how this inhumane wretch, Huddle, who cannot possibly have one drop of Union blood in his filthy carcass, interceded through the president of the Building Trades Department of the AF of L and the president of the Chicago Building Trades Council, who in his behalf begged us to withdraw our injunction, and he would in return restore us to our charter, which he had illegally revoked. He also promised that the local could hold meetings as they chose. The supervisor was to be done away with. In short, the local was to be permitted to function as it should, according to the Constitution. A majority of our members did vote to withdraw the injunction on the strength of these promises. Immediately thereafter, this wolf, in sheep's clothing, passing and parading around the country, Chicago exempted, as the general president of a labor organization, supposed to represent the poor fish of the rank and file, but in reality could not possibly represent the employer better if he was open and above board, on their payroll, got busy on one of his famous double-crossing acts. He and Punk Maloney manipulated things so that a vote was taken on the members of Local 569 as to whether or not they would amalgamate with Local 150. The vote was 204 in favor, 140 against, and 346 refusing to vote on the question. Well, the trusting, unsuspecting brothers went over to Local number 150. That is, a majority of the members of number 569 went over. We, comprising the minority, refused to go, stood by the old local, and went to the Superior Court of Cook County and applied for and obtained an injunction. These slimy supervisors of number 150 have violated this injunction in several instances and have been cited for contempt. The contempt cases are still pending before a master in chancery." End quote. So this is what happened with the injunction. And as you know, this is one of the things I had speculated about. Huddle and Maloney didn't hold up their side of the bargain. So it required Bruce and others to file for another injunction, and apparently when that one doesn't hold up, additional contempt actions to get the court orders enforced. Quoting again, "These vultures called supervisors and assistants have been and are yet going right ahead in violating the orders of the court and telling the world that the injunction is worthless and doesn't mean a thing to them. Well, we still believe there is a measure of justice in the courts, and unless we miss our guests there will soon be a day of reckoning for these enemies of society and traitors to the cause of true unionism. Lest we forget, I want to tell you that the Big King Snake also promised the members of Local Number 569 that they would only be considered in the amalgamation members of Local 569 and Number 42. Well, here is what he has done. A list of the locals he has thrown together. Locals Number 569, Number 42, Number 115, Number 117, Number 936, and Number 802. Also, anybody with the price, whether he be a barber, shoemaker, or whatnot, can get a card in this outlaw outfit. Have also been informed that they have about 3,500 members. And as I know, there are hundreds of the former members of Local Number 569 walking the streets and people from all over the country on jobs which should be held by them, as the men who have grown up with and helped make the conditions in Chicago." End quote. So this is Maloney's true project. He's not combining Bruce's union with one other union. He's taking them all over and creating one large enterprise that he is in control over. My favorite insult, and I think my dad so far, is Big King Snake, waged at Maloney, and was the inspiration for today's episode's name. Bruce closes out his article by directing it at the former members of Number 569, quoting, "Oh yes, former brother members of Number 569, I suppose you have seen Punk Maloney strutting around attired in the best of clothes. The only thing he now needs is a cane. Of course, he does not walk very much. He rides in a Lincoln auto, bought for and paid for by you. Yes, and 10 to 1, you don't have to have 7 cents to ride on the streetcar to hunt a job. How long are you going to let a big bum like him ride you over like this? Well, if you enjoy your present position, walking the streets seeking a job, you and your family hungry and in want, while this snake and the stool pigeons that surround him go riding around in Lincolns and Cadillacs, living on the best food, stopping in the best hotels, frequenting the roadhouses, etc. I say again, if you enjoy it, stay with him. If, however, you do not like this sort of treatment, rise to your dignity and walk away from him and come back to Local Number 569. Yes, we are still doing business at 643 West Washington Boulevard, and we will hold our meetings every Wednesday night. And I am pleased to tell you that the boys are already coming back, and so will you, eventually. Why not now? You may ask, how do I know this? My answer is that any outfit so rotten and un-American, illegal in every way, cannot long endure. They have had their fling, and in a very near future, when Mr. Samuel Untermeyer gets them before the bar of justice, they are through. In closing, all hail to the engineers everywhere who have had the courage to fight for honesty, justice, and true unionism. Dennis B. Ziegler, Local Number 569, Chicago, Illinois. End quote. To me, this newspaper account is extraordinary, and it also got me thinking about Bruce's education. I think he's incredibly well-spoken, and in addition to being a hoisting and operating engineer, he wrote incredibly well. I don't have his schooling records or know exactly how much school he attended, but I'm pretty certain he did not attend college, and I consider him extremely well-spoken for whatever amount of education he received in rural Pennsylvania, where he grew up. And in addition to taunting Maloney, he also puts a lot of emphasis on the members of Local 569 who moved over to 150. And the end of Bruce's account honestly made me pretty sad, knowing that he's going to be murdered in less than 3 years after this article comes out. And I think the sentiment he expresses is really shared by a lot of Americans in our current time as well. Quoting Bruce, "My answer is that any outfit so rotten and un-American, illegal in every way, cannot long endure." End quote. And sadly for Bruce, his prediction was not correct. In terms of a reckoning for this organization, it would come in the late 50s and early 60s, when the organization is finally able to hold a vote on who can run the union. And as we know, Mr. Clarence Doneth, the man who testified before the McClellan Committee, was one of the people running against Maloney's choice to continue in power. So justice came, but just about 25 years later, and that made me think about Roger Toohey, who also got justice after being unfairly imprisoned for the kidnapping of Jake the Barber. But for him too, it was 25 years too late. And that brings us to later in Maloney's life. Life catches up with Maloney, and there's a renewed interest in his union shenanigans from the 1930s and the late 50s, early 60s. And that's where we start to see the downfall of his career. First and foremost, he resigns from the union at age 74. And that's what makes way for the first vote in the Operating Engineers Union. And at that time, there are news articles calling the International Union of Operating Engineers Maloney's empire, and it contained over 279,000 members and had millions in its treasury fund. And Maloney is wanted for questioning in the McClellan Committee in 1958 to answer for Bruce's murder and for other acts going on in the Operating Engineers Union. But Maloney doesn't show up and gets a doctor's note saying that he's too ill to testify. And whether his health was actually that serious at the time or not seems to be up for debate only 2 years later. Quoting from the Tribune, July 16, 1960, federal officials, who are preparing an income tax case against Maloney, told the Tribune that they were astounded when Maloney was able to avoid scheduled appearances before the Senate committee on the ground he suffered from a heart ailment. The committee never made an attempt to learn just how sick Maloney actually was at the time, a federal official told the Tribune. End quote. So no one's doubting that Maloney had a heart ailment, but they are wondering if he used it as an excuse and just how severe it was. And there's a call also at this time in 1960 for him to be prosecuted for Bruce's murder by Cook County officials, but that doesn't happen. But as for his tax fraud issues, the same ones that Bruce tipped off federal investigators of in the 1930s, those do catch up with him. He doesn't end up serving any jail time, but he ends up settling a tax claim for about half of the amount alleged against him, paying $254,000. And when he dies, his funeral service is at St. Viator Church. And this is something that caught the family's eye in real time, because the neighborhood he lived in St. Viator is not close together. And in fact, it's where near Bruce was murdered. And the family is really disturbed by this. From Doty's papers, quoting, Maloney subsequently died a natural death in Florida on Thursday, January 2nd, 1964. His body was taken to Chicago, and funeral services were held at St. Viator's Catholic Church, where it just happens to be the closest church, or about 500 yards away from the spot where Dennis Bruce Ziegler was murdered. Since Maloney had never lived anywhere near this area, could it be that he requested services to be held at this particular church so that he could be forgiven at the scene of his worst crime? Did he try to buy his way into heaven? End quote. I'm not sure why Maloney had his services there. Maybe there is a legitimate reason for it, but I haven't been able to find one. So for now, I just note it as something that's interesting. And there's one other personal thing I found interesting about Maloney, and that's how close he was in his relationship with John Lynch, his second in command. And they seemed to be close for a very long time. When I was reviewing census records, the 1940 census actually has them listed as living in the same building. The census record has listed at 124 South Waller, Lynch, James, and Maloney, William. I will note it says out of town for William Maloney's entry, and this is 1940 when he becomes the International's president. So I don't know if he's out of town when the form is filled out, or if he's out of town in terms of he's moved to DC. But either way, it suggests that before that position, he lived at that address with James or John Lynch. So if these two were really that inseparable, that got me thinking, if we're willing to place Maloney at the crime scene, is Lynch with him? They were together when they waged the threat against Bruce, so if Maloney's there, does he have his shadow as well? Or, like with Arthur Huddle, would Maloney have ordered someone else to do the actual deed and then have him report back to them? I'll note that Huddle was murdered in DC instead of Chicago. Chicago really seems to be Maloney's turf, so that's a difference. And that makes me think for most people, he would not have carried out the violent acts personally. But I wonder if Bruce's case is different. This whole time, I've been acting as if Bruce was essentially assassinated for his political position. He was a union official who was in the way. And that is true, but I wonder if it's more than business for Maloney. I wonder if this murder is personal. And that's what makes me think maybe this one was different. Different than Huddle and different than Mr. McCarty from the beginning of the episode. I'm just not sure, and it's something we need to keep thinking about as we consider Maloney's culpability. He seems to have both personal and business motive for this event. But still, without the police file, without Pegler's papers, without more from the eyewitness's account, we don't have anything tying Maloney to February 24th, 1933, in Old Irving Park. And before I leave you for our next episode, I wanted to share with you something I found from the Chicago American on February 8th, 1958, concerning Bruce's murder. Quoting, Captain Dan Gilbert of the Chicago Cops reported the street lamps had been turned off. End quote. Turned off, not cut, which is exactly what the family said. And I want to know how, as we move on to our next suspect, Murray Humphreys. In our next episode, The Camel.